A school teacher in Philadelphia observed what might be another sign of this generation of kids having a worldview that us old folks, I guess, have not yet begun to fully appreciate. English teacher Dina Lagerman wrote about an interesting experiment that she carried out, that she's been carrying out for several years when she teaches the classic George Orwell novel 1984 to her students. The book, of course, is the futuristic dystopian novel published in 1949 by Orwell, set in the superstate of Oceania, whose residents are victims of perpetual war, omnipresent government surveillance, propaganda, and public manipulation via the thought police who persecute individualism and independent thinking, regarded as thought crimes in a tyrannical system of government overseen by the mysterious leader known as Big Brother, leading a party which seeks power entirely for its own sake rather than the good of others. Lagerman has carried out a very interesting social experiment while teaching that book for a number of years, but this year her students had a very different response, a very different reaction to that experiment for some reason. Joining us now to discuss what happened, as she described in a post at Medium.com this week titled "The Teens Will Save Us," God, I hope she's right, is Dina Lagerman. Dina, welcome to the Bradcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Sure. I know you're a writer, English teacher for high school juniors and seniors in Philadelphia, and you post articles at Medium and write for the parenting website Romper. You've also been published by Women's Health Magazine, The Week, HuffPost, and others, including Pop Sugar, which I mention just because I like saying Pop Sugar. So every year while teaching the George Orwell Big Brother classic novel 1984, warning of the all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful government in this book, which has manipulated its people to control them in all sorts of ways, many of which ring a bit too familiar, I'm afraid, in 2018, if you ask me. But you conduct a social experiment of sorts with your students who I guess don't really know they're part of this experiment until it's over, in a way to help teach the book. Tell me what you do with this experiment, and then we'll discuss both how it usually goes and then how it turned out this year for the first time.
Sure. 1984 is a very important book, as you mentioned, right now, and always, but especially right now. And I love teaching it. It's one of my favorite texts. But to be honest, it's a little slow, especially for kids today who are immersed in social media and a very quick, clickbait headlines.
Mm-hmm.
So how do I get their attention? How do I make them learn without lecturing them and making them read without having any background knowledge? Our students are luckily privileged enough to where their rights aren't being taken away yet. So how do I make them experience what the people in the novel live through every day? How do I make them understand? So my activity is that I do before the book is I tell them that, hey, you know what, guys? You're seniors. You're going to have senioritis. It's getting nicer outside soon. You're almost graduating. And I really don't want you to fail. And I think, we all agree that I want you to do well for the rest of the year. So I've collected some research, and this has been done for numerous years, and it's worked in every other school, and this is the way we battle senioritis. And they kind of look at each other and go, okay, well, what do you have for us? Mm-hmm. And I tell them, I make up statistics. I tell them, that X amount of students fail out every year, and they just eat it up. I am their teacher, so they're listening to me and they're interested. And then I say, well, these are the rules. You have to raise your hand every time you need to use the bathroom, every time you need to ask a question, every time you even need to ask your peer for something. We have to have very strict rules, very strict guidelines, because if you don't follow them, then senioritis will get you. And they're not happy with it, but I basically convince them that it's for the common good. I tell them they lose points every time they don't follow, and then they gain points if they help me kind of keep track of other students who are breaking the rules.
Wow. And so, you write that you put up posters, you basically turn the classroom into a totalitarian regime. And do the kids play along? Do they tell on others as you have instructed them in with your posters and your signs, your motivational quotes that are posted everywhere and so forth?
So not this year.
Yeah.
Not this year. I waited for 2 days, and I post a folder in my classroom that says Truth Folder. And
you had I'm sorry,
year.
you had a truth folder, you said?
Yes, a truth folder. This is the folder where they would write notes in if they saw any wrongdoing.
Okay.
So because I wanted them to tell the truth, right? Because that mattered for senioritis, so curing it.
And in the past,
and
in the past, before we talk about what happened this year, in the past they've gone along with this experiment for several days while you're teaching the book, and
so
yeah.
So I taught it a couple years ago, 4 times in a row, and then I took a little break from teaching, and this is the first year I'm teaching it again. And in the past, when I had taught it, I actually did it a little bit more intense, even to where I asked them to kind of give up their privacy voluntarily. And, I asked them to write their parents' salary on a piece of paper and tell me everything they do every single minute of the day. And they looked up at me, and obviously I didn't read this information. It all went in the trash. But they looked up at me for a second and questioned me. I'm like, you can't question me. I'm kind of sick of this chaos that's been going on, and I need my classroom back. You have taken advantage. So I have a more of like a dictatorship part in the process.
Right.
But at that point in the past, they would just raise their hand and say, well, so-and-so is doing so-and-so, and then I would give them a point. And then when they saw the process, quote, working to their advantage, then they would start telling on each other. And at first, they thought it was a joke. The first day, they thought, oh, ha, 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 so funny. But then by the second day, when they see that the points are still there and some of them are losing points, they're starting to get more serious. And they really do fall in line, and the classroom is completely silent. And you could see they're feeling very threatened, but they also don't know what to do because I'm clearly in power at this point. And then, when they kind of learned what they need to learn, I stopped the experiment, and then we discuss it and we debrief, and they're obviously always very relieved that it's not that it's not real.
Right.
And obviously none of them, and they're always like, well, did I lose any points? I'm like, no, you didn't lose any points. Like, you're good, but what did we learn about ourselves?
Wow.
What did we learn about when the teacher takes away your power? I am the authority here. What happened?
And that had been pretty predictably in the past. It would go down like that. Not this year, however. What happened? I know there was a break between the time you last ran this experiment and now, but what happened this year when you tried this the same experiment?
Well, I know that there's been a break, but I've just been watching teenagers change. And so I wondered what would happen this year. So I did the same thing. This year I added the whole senioritis about how, we really need to battle it. And I also got other teachers involved, and the other teachers loved it because they were able to see how the students react, and they kind of reported to me and saying, well, so-and-so is doing this. So it's very controlled to make sure the kids are fine and they're not, being distressed over it or anything like that. So this year, it was something else. This year, they did not go down without a fight. I mean, they actually didn't go down at all. They, after the first day I introduced the experiment, they threw like 50 questions at me. Well, what if this happens? And what if that happens? And, what if I tell on this person and that person gets upset? And will that person lose points? And what if that person gets suspended? Like, they had a lot of concerns, which my other students didn't have before. They said, well, this seems like we're living in kindergarten, like all of these rules, this seems like you're taking advantage of us, and I was like, no, this is for your common good. And I have a really good rapport with my students, so they do trust me. So this was day one. And by the end of day one, so I have them in the beginning of day. So by end of day one, I'm hearing other teachers come to me and say, hey, they kind of like are getting it. They're getting upset. They're getting upset. And that same night, I get an email. I don't get an email, but I get an email forwarded to me that the president of the student government sent to the administration, expressing his displeasure with this activity. And he basically says, I feel like this is fascism and it's totalitarian and we will not stand for this. And I don't even have this student.
But
he's not one of my seniors.
But the students were rebelling. The students were standing up and pushing back against this, banding together, it seems, and pushing back against your tyranny, Dina. It's fascinating. And you write that for the first time since I've done this experiment, the students won. Why? What happened? What has changed as you see it? Since you ran this experiment in previous years, do you have any idea why it was this time they stood up, pushed back, rebelled, and won?
I have some ideas, and listen, I'm not a researcher. I'm not a scientist. I don't do social research. I don't know, but this is just my observation of teenagers in general. The word that they're using now is woke, right? They're all woke now. They're participating in marches. They're participating in, their student government. They're listening to the news. They're reading the news more. Every day we play CNN 10 for them so they know what's going on in the world every morning. They are involved. And I think in our current political climate where everything is so hostile and divisive, they are learning. These kids, I walk around and even in the cafeteria, I'll listen to them talk about DACA. And they'll talk about, issues that I don't remember ever discussing when I was a kid, as a teenager. Even the kids that I had previously didn't really discuss topics like that. They weren't on the horizon, I guess. They weren't interested. They weren't affected by it. My students, these teenagers, I go to the Women's March and I see all of these kids, a sea of teenagers coming with posters and signs, and they truly are paying attention. And I ask my students, why did you rebel? Because at the end, they won. Like I said, they rebelled. They said, we will not stand for it. They went to the administration. They said, this is not okay. Our rights are not going to be taken away. And I said, why did you do it? I could have failed you, right? The premise was, if you lose enough points, you fail for the year.
Right. I
could have failed you. I am the authority. How do you go against me? Why did you do it? And the response I got was, you were taking away my rights and you were taking away my freedoms, and it did not make sense. And that's kind of what, and I always teach them, if something doesn't make sense to you, that's when you need to stand up and ask why. You don't just take it sitting down. And a lot of my kids, that's what they said. And when I asked some of them why they fell in line, they said, it was easier because I didn't want to get in trouble. I would never tell on anyone to gain more points, but I just didn't want to get in trouble,
Yeah.
And there's different versions, but overall, the majority of them rose to the occasion. When I when I turned the student government president to my side, kind of, and I told him what I was trying to do, and he decided to help me,
right.
And he resigned, quote unquote, in front of the students, and the students audibly gasped when he resigned in front of them. And after they left my class, they found a new leader. Multiple people were like, all right, I'm taking over. I'm going to help us. And they were making posters, down with senioritis.
Wow.
So it was incredible. My heart swelled. I was so proud of them, just like when I watch the kids now at Parkland and their speeches and how articulate they are and how beautiful their speeches are and heart-wrenching. And they all just make me cry. But I actually cried when my kids said, we will not have our rights taken away from us. And as a teenager, I don't even remember thinking that way. So it's definitely, to me, it's a trend.